What if a regular, unremarkable seeming Pokemon could borrow just one stat from a legendary? In certain cases, replacing a single stat on a Pokemon with that of a legendary would turn them from bad to broken in an instant. Take Hisuian Electrode for example. This Pokemon is known for having an incredible speed stat, much higher than even many legendaries, but it's balanced by the fact that its other stats are quite bad, especially its very low base 80 special attack. But what if it had the base 170 special attack stat of Kyurem White? Now Hisuian Electrode is one of the scariest Pokemon of all time. There is a fan-made Pokemon format where you can do exactly this, and it's called Godly Gift. In this format, you are allowed to use just one restricted legendary, and this legendary will share one of its stats with each of your team members. This format refers to these Pokemon as gods that bless each of your team members with one stat. Each Pokemon slot on your team corresponds with a stat. So on this Kyurem White team, Hisuian Electrode is in the 4th slot, the special attack slot, and therefore it shares that massive 170 base special attack with Kyurem White. Everything else here shares a stat with Kyurem White as well. Kyurem White has a pretty respectable 125 base HP, which it is sharing here with Pecharunt. It's actually quite a big upgrade. Mandibuzz gets access to a nice 120 base attack. Kyurem White's special defense isn't that great for a legendary, only base 100. But that's a bit of an improvement over Landorus Therian's base 80, better than nothing. And finally, Volcanion in the final slot gets a bit of a speed upgrade, sharing a base 95 speed stat with Kyurem White. The only stat not being shared with the team here is physical defense, because Kyurem White itself is in the defense slot. Whatever slot you put your god in, it will not share that stat with the rest of the team. So it's good to put your legendary in the slot of its worst stat. Kyurem White only has 90 defense, not a very good option to share with the team. This team by the player Les2BG is just one example of the fun team building possibilities you can achieve in the Godly Gift format. Building teams for this format is like a fun puzzle, trying to squeeze the most value out of each of these distributed stats. But some Pokemon were actually a little bit too powerful for this concept when sharing their stats with others or receiving stats from gods, and ended up getting banned from the format for it. But before we take a look at these banned Pokemon from Godly Gift, let me raise you another question. What if there was a Pokemon format where you were only allowed to use horse-based Pokemon? Such a horse-only metagame could push the very boundaries of what competitive Pokemon even is. I have decided to make such a format real, and I am hosting an open tournament for it. This Thursday at 6 PM EST, the Horse HAVOC tournament will begin, and I'll be live commentating the event myself on this very YouTube channel. There will be a 128 player entry cap. Check out the description for the list of legal horses and other rules. The winner of this tournament will receive an incredible Horse Council hoodie from the JimothyCool.com store, free of charge. I have no horse in this race, but maybe you could have 6 of them. The event of the century awaits. Thank you. One example of a banned god in the Godly Gift format is Deoxys Attack. This is an incredible offensive Pokemon with base 180 in both of its offensive stats and a massive 150 speed. But of course it has the drawback of its terrible defenses. But when sharing its stats with others, they don't have that same drawback. Imagine something like Ursaluna, who has incredible bulk and attack, but it's kept balanced thanks to its low speed. But now it has 150 base speed. I mean, that's just crazy. This clearly breaks the Pokemon. By itself, this wouldn't be that bad. I mean, part of this format is constructing broken synergies like this, but the fact that you also have 2 other game-breaking Pokemon is what pushes Deoxys Attack over the edge. The 180 base special attack could be given a Hisuian Electrode to create a monster, and that 180 base attack you could throw into something like Talonflame or another fast physical threat. And then on top of that, you also just have a Deoxys Attack on your team. It's easy to see why this is a little bit overpowered. Some other banned Pokemon include Calyrex Shadow Rider, Koraidon, and Miraidon. You might also be surprised to learn that Blissey is a banned Pokemon. Blissey has the highest base HP stat in the entire game of 255, and an incredible 135 special defense as well. Blissey is designed around this though, as its physical defense stat is only 10, and it is incredibly weak to physical attacks. But if you could use Blissey as a god, you could very easily make something indestructible. Toxapex, for example. This guy has enormous defensive stats, but a very low base HP. But even then, Toxapex functions very well as a defensive Pokemon. Imagine Toxapex with the base 255 HP. This this thing would be absolutely unkillable. It's similarly game-breaking if you allow Blissey to receive stats from a god. What if instead of having 10 base defense, Blissey shared a 150 base defense stat with Calyrex-Ice Rider? Now the entire downside that Blissey is built around is gone, and you have an absolutely ridiculous defensive Pokemon on your hand. Now you can probably see why this got banned. What's also interesting is that some of the restricted god Pokemon are not actually legendary. In some cases, this is to prevent them from being used as a stat receiver. Crawdaunt is considered a god. This would not be a very good choice since its stats aren't fantastic, but if you gave Crawdaunt a massive speed stat, it would be pretty damn broken with that incredible stab damage from adaptability. So they made this into a god to restrict it from being used as a stat receiver. The reason it's not just banned like Blissey is because Blissey is broken as both a god and a stat receiver. Crawdaunt as a god is not broken. Alomomola is also considered a god because of how powerful it was as a stat receiver. In this now illegal stall team, Giratina was used as the god, distributing its incredible defensive stats to a bunch of powerful defensive Pokemon. Alomomola is balanced around having really high base HP but terrible stats elsewhere, so gaining Giratina's 120 base special defense made it pretty broken. This whole team was crazy, to be honest, with Hatterene receiving 150 base HP from Giratina and Clodsire getting a significant defense buff. Alomomola has some merit as a god, since it can share that huge HP stat. This is the highest HP stat on any god in the rule set, but with such terrible stats everywhere else, it's not a very desirable option overall. So what are some broken combinations you can actually pull off in the current rule set? Here's a team that uses Ho-Oh as the god and some interesting Pokemon like Sinistcha and Iron Hands. Sinistcha is receiving the HP from Ho-Oh. It's not much, base 106, but pretty significant buff to Sinistcha, and a seemingly low HP stat for a legendary can actually be a pretty massive buff for other Pokemon. In the case of Sinistcha, it makes it a way more effective, calm mind, bulky sweeper. That's quite a big boost. Meowscarada receives the attack from Ho-Oh. Primarina gets a small defense boost from Ho-Oh, only base 90 defense, but it's a little bit better than Primarina's base 74. The special attack is not being shared, but the special defense is, and this is the biggest one. This is Ho-Oh's highest stat, and Iron Hands gets a lot out of this. This is a great use of a godly gift stat share, because Iron Hands has incredible HP attack and really solid defense, awful special defense, but now it has 154 special defense. So Iron Hands becomes incredibly good with that buff. Stupidly good, especially with Terra Fairy, Drain Punch, and Swords Dance. This is a really effective win condition, and probably the team's main win condition. And then Excadrill, just receiving a little bit of a boost to speed. So Ho-Oh has pretty well distributed stats, small buffs to other Pokemon for the most part, but the big buff is to Iron Hands from the special defense boost. This is a pretty cool team, I think. Pretty cool team. Arceus is a pretty interesting Pokemon in this format. Doesn't seem like it will be that great, because it only has 120 in all its stats. You can get higher reward from other gods that have really lopsided, like Ho-Oh, for example, who has that massive special defense, which can really help other Pokemon. But having well-distributed stats like this is actually pretty good, and this team takes advantage of it, as well as Arceus just being a solid Pokemon on its own with the Swords Dance Extreme Speed set here. So everything here is going to receive 120 to its respective stat, and Ogerpon Wellspring appreciates that. Getting a 120 base HP is quite nice. Samurott actually gets a lot out of that attack boost to 120, dealing way more damage, especially because sharpness is multiplying that damage further. Iron Moth receives the defense, actually. Pretty creative use of the stat distribution here, because of course it actually has a higher special attack than Arceus, but very low defense. That's a significant boost to defense, doubling the stat, making Iron Moth much more effective as a booster energy sweeper. Gouging Fire receives the special defense, which is also a very nice boost. And then Iron Hands with speed on it is a frightening concept. 120 base speed on this is very good, because I believe that actually the booster energy is going to boost speed in this instance, because its base stat is increased, invested in, and with the plus nature. So Iron Hands will actually end up being like an aggro Iron Hands here, totally changing the Pokemon's role. That's pretty fun. This is an example of how Paradox Pokemon can be pretty creatively used in Godly Gift, allowing you to get a booster energy boost on different stats. That's pretty fun. Some of the Pokemon that get the most out of the Godly Gift format are the Rotom forms. These forms all have really low base HP but solid stats elsewhere, so even a little bit of a buff to HP has a high impact. In this case, the god is Lunala, granting Rotom Heat with a pretty significant 137 base HP, and turning it into a much more effective boots, bulky Pokemon that can spread burn and pivot to these powerful threats. And this team has the game plan of a grassy terrain offense team. Lunala has a really strong stat distribution, one of the best for Godly Gift, I think. Sneasler only gets a small buff to its defense here. Lunala with base 89 defense, improving base 60 defense from Sneasler, but because Sneasler is holding the Grassy Seed to boost its defense further in grassy terrain, that little bit of extra base defense is felt here and allows more sweep opportunity for the Sneasler. Fezandipity receives a pretty massive buff to its special attack, base 137, which is a significant improvement from base 70. And Fezandipity is actually completely changed from a bulky pivot Pokemon into an offensive threat with a unique typing of Poison Fairy, Stab, Moonblast, and Sludge Bomb, and then Heat Wave for coverage off the back of 137 special attack. Actually really scary on this. And all of these moves are also spreading poison with the Toxic Chain ability. This is quite a creative use of a Pokemon, totally changing its role thanks to a new stat. Great Tusk also receiving a special defense boost from Lunala, which is really good on Great Tusk. And Rillaboom gets a bit of a speed boost. Not much, but a little bit of a speed boost from 85 to 97. So this is a really cool offense team. It gets a lot out of Pokemon like Rotom Heat and Fezandipity that you would not otherwise think are that fantastic, especially in Gen 9. You sometimes see Fezandipity, but right here, it's totally changing its identity. And the little bit of extra defense value from the Sneasler Grassy Seed is also pretty fun. This team was built by the player Phrase. Shout out to them. This is probably my favorite Godly Gift team I've seen so far, using Zekrom, who is not usually a great legendary, but in Godly Gift, it shines through a lot because it has a really nice stat distribution. You just take a look at it. Usually you think of Zekrom, you think of its massive attack, but it has pretty nice, well-distributed stats everywhere else. Maybe not the speed, but you can get a lot out of Zekrom in this format. And the first slot is simple, just a little bit of an HP buff to Samurott, not even really getting much out of it. You're mostly using this just as a normal Samurott Hisui, setting spikes. Gouging Fire is getting the most out of Zekrom because it has a 150 base attack now. You can clearly see why that's great. Turn this into a monstrous Dragon Dance win con. Ogerpon Wellspring is getting the defense stat, which is interesting. Zekrom has 120 base defense. That's actually very good. You don't think of Zekrom as a defensive Pokemon, but 120 base defense on Ogerpon Wellspring is a significant buff right there. And this is the coolest one here. Screamtail becomes really scary on this team thanks to the support from Zekrom, because it gets a special attack boost from a measly base 65 all the way up to 120. Once again, you don't think of Zekrom as a special attacker, but it does randomly have this really high special attack. Usually not that useful on Zekrom itself because you're not using this as a special threat ever, maybe a mixed threat sometimes, but if you can give this stat to Screamtail, suddenly this is a frightening Pokemon. Screamtail is fast, it has good stab types, and it's got a really nice special attacking move pool with Calm Mind, Flamethrower for really good coverage to hit the steals. So Screamtail all of a sudden is frightening. And then Great Tusk also gets a lot out of a little here. Zekrom only has 100 special defense, but Great Tusk's special defense is really low, only 53. So a significant buff to Great Tusk's special defense there, boosting it up to 100. And really turning this into a very well-rounded Pokemon. That's its biggest drawback, but making Great Tusk way better with such a buff. But I think this is probably the coolest Godly Gift team I've seen so far. I think Zekrom actually is an amazing choice for one of the gods with just really solid stats everywhere. And I thought I'd share one final team here with one of the best Pokemon in the format as a god, who has a pretty interesting application here, where it's actually providing a Pokemon with a lower stat on purpose. Calyrex-Ice Rider is a really good choice, and you can see why, with such amazing stats almost everywhere. Once again, you're given a Rotom form way higher HP that has a massive impact because Rotom Wash is such a good defensive Pokemon with its typing and move pool. Such an effective pivot. And when you give this 100 base HP, it's massive. Meowscarada gets a whopping 165 base attack, and easy to see why that's so good. Meowscarada, one of the better stat receivers in this format for attack specifically. Clefable, known for having terrible stats, another fantastic stat receiver. In this case, it's receiving defense from Calyrex-Ice Rider, and this guy has 150 base defense. That's just amazing. Really, really powerful. Great Tusk receiving the special defense. Obviously incredible to give this 130 base special defense. But Raging Bolt is actually getting nerfed. Raging Bolt loses speed because Calyrex-Ice Rider has only 50 base speed. But this team has a Trick Room game plan, so it's not all in on the Trick Room, of course. Calyrex-Ice Rider can take advantage of the Trick Room to sweep itself and be sort of self-sufficient with Trick Room. This will reverse the way speed works, so the slower Pokemon moves first. But I suppose as a backup plan, the Raging Bolt also has low speed. So if you Trick Room and this goes down, Raging Bolt can come in and be another Trick Room threat and close out the game that way. This team has interesting, malleable game plans with, you know, normal team and then the Trick Room package of Calyrex and Great Neck in the final slot. Just a quick note, folks. It turns out that some of these sample teams I've been looking at are outdated, and the Pokemon Raging Bolt and Gouging Fire are now considered gods as well, making some of these teams illegal now. But those Pokemon can easily be substituted with other ones, and the teams I showed can still mostly function as I described. I'd recommend giving this format a go and seeing what fun combinations you can come up with yourself. This format is playable on Pokemon Showdown, and you can find it under the Other Metagames section. I'll link some resources in the description for you to get started. Thank you for watching.